Welcome back to the channel. So I thought I would talk about something that I did right. So I talked a couple videos ago about the thing that I think I haven't done right in terms of my planning to be an expat. And that was just the fact that I haven't begun downsizing as quickly as I should. And that I haven't been as aggressive in terms of just getting rid of crap that I own. But I want to talk about the thing that I did right. And it's not about the specifics, it's more of kind of what led to it. 13 or 14 years ago, I went through a divorce, and it ended up just being costly for a number of reasons. I think a divorce tends to cost more than what people sometimes think it's going to cost. One of those things was that I had the house, but she got the equity in the house. And I ended up getting a new job that was 900 miles away from where we had lived. And the housing market at that time, although it was beginning to recover somewhat, had not recovered in my city and specifically in like the area, the part that I lived in. And it was kind of a weird house because it was a large house. I think it wasn't in the kind of hip neighborhood that I think would have appealed to certain people who would want to rent. I don't know, it was just a quirky house, and I think that would have been a disaster renting it. But it was also a disaster continuing to pay the mortgage, which I did, I think for about 5.5 more years. So I was paying the mortgage, I was paying utilities. I did have somebody stay in the house for about a year to keep an eye on it, and they took care of the utilities while I still paid the mortgage. Just taking care of the upkeep of the house, traveling back and forth 900 miles on a pretty frequent basis. It was absolutely a nightmare those years. And what happened was that things just began kind of spiraling. I had a couple other financial disasters happen in terms of some medical costs, and they were just like things just kept kind of compounding. And it was, in a way, it was a perfect storm. So that 7 years ago, I still had the house. I was still paying this mortgage. All of my credit cards were tapped out. So I was paying the minimum payment on all my credit cards. I was paying the mortgage. I was also paying a student loan. So all of these were six-figure debts. The house was a six-figure mortgage. The credit cards was over $100,000. The student loan, which had doubled in size because of some deferments that I had taken 30 years ago, but I'd been paying this outlandish amount of money, monthly payments for about, I don't even know. I mean, at that point, it was probably about 15 straight years. And I'd actually paid 3 times what I had borrowed. And the payments were still going up. So that wasn't, I was seeing nothing going down. Nothing was being resolved. So I just sunk into like a really, really bad depression, and also just a state of stasis where I really wasn't doing anything actively other than working my job to try to pay, well, other than working that job and then having a second job, just to stay afloat. I couldn't figure, I really just, I think I just couldn't come up with any kind of solution. But I was also the depression and the kind of just stasis where I would just be paralyzed by debt. And I had other periods in my life where I had a lot of debt. And so it was something that I had experienced before. And the fact that I was experiencing it again at that point in my life was really, really depressing, because I couldn't see any way that I could possibly retire. it just seemed like I'm never going to be able to retire. I'm never going to get out of this. And I was just kind of brainstorming, and I didn't have the energy that I had when I was in my mid-30s, which was if I found myself in a bad situation in terms of, owing a big bill or something, I was pretty good at coming up with an idea that I could translate into a decent amount of money to then pay that off. So anyways, all of which is to say was that how many years ago? 7 years ago, I was in a bad spot. So a side story to all of this is that I grew up in a blue collar family. It was kind of paycheck to paycheck for the most part. I wouldn't say, we never went without food, but the end of the month was always down to the last bit of money that my parents had. I mean, that was always the case. So when we traveled, it would be to see relatives in Tennessee or a couple times in Maine. As an adult, I travel throughout the United States, and I live throughout the United States, and I've seen most of the country. But 7 years ago, other than going to Canada, I hadn't been out of the country. And there were a couple of reasons. One was either when I was younger, I didn't have the money. And then when I did have the money, I was just working too much. I couldn't really find the time to make a trip. I also hadn't done the kind of research to realize that certain places aren't as expensive as other places. The idea of going to Thailand, it's like, who could afford to do that? That seemed crazy. And then I began researching it. Probably, I don't know the exact year, but I guess probably 15 years ago now is when I began researching. First began really researching it, and wanting to go, but thinking like, oh, this might be a possibility for being able to retire, but I also still had all this debt and everything, and taking a trip seemed kind of crazy. And then, again, 7 years ago, I was working the 2 jobs, and so one of the checks that I got, I just earmarked it. It was a check for my second job. So it wasn't like a ton of money, but I just earmarked it. And probably one night it was probably one of those like 2 a.m, 3 a.m, having insomnia, having anxiety, I don't know. I just booked a flight to Thailand. I used my debit card because I just deposited some money. Now, this is crazy to think about. The flight, I want to say that the flight was about $650, $700. That is insane. I can't remember the last time I've seen a flight from the US to Thailand anywhere near that. Like maybe every once in a while I've seen it for like $1,000. I've never seen it under $1,000. And I've seen it a lot more than that. So, but I just ended up just compulsively booking this flight. And I think I was also inspired by the fact I began looking at Airbnbs and things like that. And I was like, wow, you can actually stay in a room for like $10 a night back then. I'm not sure what it is right now, but back then you could find a $10 a night room or a $15. And it wasn't a bad place. I mean, it was like a decent place to stay for $15 a night, $10 a night. And for $20 a night, you're like creeping into like luxury. So my idea was it was going to be 6 weeks. I was going to go to Chiang Mai, go to Bangkok, and then I thought like, well, if I'm in the area, why don't I just go to Vietnam too? So I was going to go to Vietnam, then back to Bangkok, and then Phuket. And I made the mistake of kind of figuring out my itinerary and booking a lot of things. And so I ended up taking the trip, falling in love with Chiang Mai. And I was only going to be there for about a week, and I loved it, and I hated that I was leaving. And I went to Bangkok and did not like Bangkok. I mean, I don't know. I think some of it had to do with where I was staying. And I just thought, screw this. I'm actually just going to cancel the rest of my itinerary and go back to Chiang Mai, which I did, and which I continued to love. And so when I flew back to the US, I couldn't get it out of my head. I was like, I want to live here. This is a place that I want to live. It's doable and it's affordable. So how can I make this happen? And so I don't want to get into the specifics in terms of what I did, and because everybody's situation is different, depending upon what your job is and and it's going to be more difficult for some people than other people, and what worked for me. And I did some stuff that I think a financial planner or somebody would say that's the worst possible thing you could have done, which turned out to be the best possible thing I could have done. So, but again, I don't want to get into like the specifics. But what I will say is that the trip sparked the motivation that I needed to figure out a solution to my problems. And that's the big takeaway, I think, which is that I went somewhere and I came back and I just thought, I've got to figure this out. I've got to make this work. So what I did, and I think that this is one of my strengths, to be honest, which is that if I really focus on something, I can come up with a solution and a decent solution to the problem. I've always done this. I mean, times when I had no money when I was younger. I mean, there were times when I was just dead broke. I always came up with a solution, always. But I needed that inspiration. And the problem was that before I had taken a trip to Thailand, I didn't have any motivation. I was just like, I'm going to have to work the rest of my life. This is it. My life is going to be working until I just drop over dead. And it's hard to be motivated to solve problems when that is still your fate. And so for me, the trip allowed me to be able to implement a plan. But I spent probably the next 4 months, every single day, I just worked out all of my finances. I looked at like everything I owed. I was I'd given up so much hope that I didn't know what interest I was paying on things. I was just in denial and putting it out of my mind. I began looking at like where my money was going, the little bit of money that I did have, what things could I cut out. But I finally, after about 4 months, I came up with this kind of, and again, this is probably the thing that the financial planner would have scoffed at and told me not to do, but I did something that allowed me to pay off half of my credit cards. I just needed like a little bit of a hook into that debt, like a big enough chunk that I could then begin to maneuver, essentially. And so I did that, and with a plan in place in terms of like, how can I begin whittling down this debt? What can I do? And then I needed to put the house back on the market. And then I needed to figure out a solution for the student loans. And I would say, as of 3 years ago, I've completely reversed everything. I don't have a mortgage. I didn't make any money on the house, but I don't have a mortgage. I'm not paying money to just watch it disappear. I no longer have a student loan debt. All the credit cards are paid off. The credit cards have been paid off for probably about 5 years. And I never put more on the credit card than I can pay. So all of that has been taken care of. And I've been able to kind of reimburse myself for the money that I used to pay off the debt in the first place. And I have a plan to be able to amass kind of enough savings and investments to live extraordinarily comfortably once I do retire in 2 years. And that includes, I have a pension, I have Social Security, which I'll be able to collect in 2 years, and I have investments. And all of that, I could not have imagined 7 years ago. I couldn't have imagined a world 7 years ago where this was possible, where not only are the debts paid, but I can live an extraordinarily great life in Southeast Asia. And if I decide not to do that, if for some reason I think, or if for some reason I retire overseas, and after 3 years I decide, you know what, I'd rather just go back to the US, I can afford to do that and live well. So I think like two reasons I really wanted to make this video. One is that you don't want to come over here with financial baggage. You don't really want to do that, I think. And again, I'm not saying this to be judgmental. I mean, one thing I really, really hate in kind of comment sections is where people are like, want to tell people that they're stupid for whatever reason. They're stupid for like their financials, for finding themselves in a certain financial situation when you're in your 50s or your 60s. And I'm not judgmental about that because, everybody's circumstances are different, and everybody's upbringing is different, and everybody's, it's like great. It's great if you've been putting away like a certain percentage of your income starting when you were in 20s. Good for you. I'm happy for you. But a lot of people have not been able to do that, and I think everybody's situation is different. Do I regret certain financial things from when I was younger? Absolutely. But I think the main thing is that I was able to recognize at a certain point that it was unsustainable, and that if I wanted to achieve the thing that I wanted, that I would have to figure out a solution. The second main reason I wanted to make this is just to say, hey, maybe you're not motivated yet, and maybe you haven't taken that trip. And I do see this on videos with people who've moved to the Philippines, especially, just because I've watched a lot of those. I'm not sure if the Philippines is the place that I would want to retire. I haven't been there yet. Maybe I'll go and I'll fall in love with the Philippines. But I have seen a lot of videos where people are, like, once they get over there, they become inspired to figure out how to make it work. And if finances isn't a problem for you, that's terrific. One of the things I wanted to make sure was that I would be able to retire at the age that I'm at right now, or in 1 week. So my birthday is in 1 week, and I could, and I would be perfectly fine if I did that. I would be in a decent position. But I also, and again, this was kind of a little bit of a gamble on my part, which was there a way that I could leave my work for a year and then go back to it a year from now and basically, spend another, whatever it is, 16 months, I think, before officially retiring. And because of the job that I have, I was able to figure out how to do that. But I had to apply for it, and I had to, make a case for it and everything. And I'll have like a somewhat reduced salary. So that's why I'm not retiring in a week. It's because I basically have a year that gives me a little bit of a sample of like what life is going to be like retired. And is this what I want? So I think that's the other thing too, is like having a tiered structure in terms of like your goals for what your retirement goals. Once I began reversing the situation that I was in 7 years ago, then I began looking at like, what would life look like if I retired at 60? And if I'm not going to retire at 60, what will life look like if I retired at 62? How much better of a position? It turns out I'm going to be in a much better position retiring at 62 than at 60. So that was another reason to not retire in a week. It's just because I think at 62, it's going to make a significant difference. And basically, I'm away for a year, so it's almost like being retired for a year and then going back for one more final year, and then officially retiring. So I'm kind of I feel like I'm quasi-retired, even though I'm officially not. But yeah, I just want to, you know, I want to still think ahead, because it's like I don't want to be 80 years old, broke in a country that's not my country. And yeah, so I just want to make sure that I'm still, if I have to hire somebody to help me, if I have to hire a caregiver, I just want to make sure I can do that and do it comfortably and still have the means to live well. So that's where I'm at. I mean, I'm looking at all contingency plans and making sure that I'm in a good position for all of them. All right, thanks for listening to me ramble on about this. I know it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, and I know that there's so many factors and so many variables, you know, so I don't want to pretend that anything I say can lead to any kind of easy solution or any solution. But I hope that if you found yourself, or you find yourself in a situation currently that I was in 7-8 years ago, that I did find myself in a situation where I felt completely hopeless, and I did figure out a solution to it. And I hope that at least maybe inspires you to kind of think outside the box, and to or take a trip that ignites that motivation that you need to get to that point of making a solution, which is what I needed. I think I needed some sort of hope. I needed something to look forward to, and I needed a goal. And without those things, I don't think I could have gotten to that next level. As I said earlier, I'm not judgmental at all about people's particular situations when it comes to this. And I wish more people didn't bring their self-righteousness to the table when it came to this. This is something that in expat Facebook groups, which I'll talk about at some point in terms of how they're useful and how they're not useful, and occasionally on YouTube, but I would say especially the expat Facebook groups, there's so much self-righteousness that if somebody feels like, oh, they got their shit together, like, why don't you have your shit together? And it's like, it doesn't work like that. It really doesn't, you know? I mean, there's a lack of empathy that I find really disheartening. One thing I will say, though, is that that kind of lack of empathy or bitterness or self-righteousness that I see in those groups is not what I see when I meet people in town, when I travel, when I go to Thailand, or I'm in Vietnam, or I'm in Cambodia. I tend to meet people who are generous, other expats who want to help, expats who've gone through their own trials and tribulations, and tend to be empathetic. So I do feel like that's a kind of a small minority, but it's a very obnoxious minority and vociferous, and it gets disheartening if you're looking for advice and you're kind of scrolling down and people are like just wanting to insult whoever has posted a question, sometimes about finances or something about, it's like, oh, I have this amount of money or whatever. So anyways, I just want to make it clear, I don't have judgment about that, you know. you know, you look at a million people and there are going to be a million different reasons why people are in the situations that they're in, either positively or negatively. And I have been in both. I think the key is understanding the nuance of the situation that you're in and trying to figure out how to overcome the obstacles connected to that nuance. So anyways, I hope some of this was helpful. Sorry about rambling so long, and I will see you in the next video. If you like this, please hit the like button. If you're not subscribed and you think some of this might be helpful, please subscribe. I'm grateful to the new subscribers, and I will see you soon.